Hello. Today I'd like to start a new philosophy series, this one on Honkai Star Rail, which is, if you didn't know, it's made by MiHoYo, same developers as made Genshin Impact and Honkai Impact 3rd, which you might not think is a very philosophical game in nature, but it's actually surprising how much the developers have, in the lore of the game, introduced philosophical concepts that we're going to dive into. Today I want to focus on a particular kind, which is the Aeons, and how they relate to ancient Greek philosophy, particularly the Platonic forms and how Aristotle and later the scholastics brought those up. So let's dive into it. If we go into the databank here, we can see some of the main concepts in the game, particularly the Aeons. Aeons are, as they say, intelligent life forms can only faintly discern that aeons tread upon paths imperceptible to mortal beings. So here are like the kind of aeons they have. They have the trailblaze, they have the destruction. Trailblaze follows the path of the trailblaze, which is focused on, I guess, exploration, going into the unknown. Destruction is, of course, of destroying. The birth of the universe is a mistake, it says. War is the only common language. The avatar of entropy. You have the hunt. You have erudition, which is like knowledge. Harmony, which includes order. Nihility, which includes death, despair, nothingness, worthlessness. Preservation, abundance, veracity. Elation, remembrance, beauty, and so on and so forth. So, if we want to ask about what that means philosophically, we can dive into how this ties into Aristotle. So first, we'll go ahead and write this down here. Their aeons are tied together with their path. So the path, for example, would be something like the hunt, nihility, destruction, so on. The aeons with those would be Lan, Ix for nihility, and Nanook for destruction, just as some examples. What's interesting about this, though, is that the aeons aren't identical with the path. So, for example, there was Taziroth, I believe. I have no idea how to spell this. And he was the aeon of propagation. So what's curious about this is that Taziroth died, but the propagation hasn't ceased because it's, people can still propagate. So, but he also came into being at some point. He arose to become an aeon. So there's a lot of questions here about what are aeons, what are their paths, how are they related? And I think we want to look into that more deeply. Let's head over to Greek philosophy, namely the idea of the form in Greek philosophy. So if we want to go over what the forms are, let's start with Plato. Plato, in the Socratic dialogues, talks about this idea of forms. So you might think about something like a chair, right? There's a lot of chairs out there, but it's not very hard for us to identify what a chair is. Even though they can be made of different materials, they can be made of different shapes, sizes, types, but we always recognize them as chairs. There's a kind of universal quality to them that we can abstract and understand as. Same with like horses, for example. The form in this example, if we were to take chairs, we would have a form of chair, or chairness, that we abstract from all these chairs. And we would say that's like the chairness of a chair is how much of a chair it is, like its essence, its nature. Same with like horse, right? A form of horse would be like called hoarseness, maybe. And maybe you would try to describe like things that are almost horses but aren't, and be like, oh, this isn't exactly a horse. It's not. It has some amount of hoarseness, so to speak, but it's not really a horse. Now, this idea isn't really interesting talking about chairs and horses, but it becomes a lot more interesting if you're instead talking about something like justice. A form of justice would be justice itself, or the nature of justice. And that's something that we would all want to kind of understand, because ultimately the forms are the more general truths, general or higher truths about things. In the sense of, if we want to understand, we see many, many different instances of justice, for example. But if we want to understand what makes all these things just or unjust, we want to look at the higher truth about what justice itself is, right? The form of justice. What makes things just? What makes things unjust? So, I mean, when it comes to chairs, we generally don't really care about that, right? So we don't really debate too often about whether something is a chair or not. But if you were a carpenter and you wanted to understand very well how to make different kinds of chairs, and you might actually be interested in that, you might go look into the form of chairness, right? And try to understand what makes a chair a chair. So those are the kind of questions we have about forms. And that's why that's usually very important for people who are interested in understanding the higher truths of things. You can see how that ties into the eons. Because you have and the paths, right? If you have a path of destruction, and that's related to the form of destruction, then people who are thinking about things like death, I guess death would be more like nihility. But if you're contemplating death, or you're contemplating the meaning of life, whether there is meaning in life, you're contemplating the forms of the meaning of life, right? You want to understand not just what's meaningful for one person or what's meaningful for a group or in a certain scenario. You want to understand what meaning itself is, the highest truths about meaning. That's really what the form is all about. It's the highest truths out there. And there's kind of 3 different kinds of thoughts about the forms. The first one we'll talk about is Plato himself. Plato talked about basically has the idea of a heaven of forms. The idea that chairness, hoarseness, justice, all these things, there's like a form of heavens, which is the true reality, where all the forms are. Justice, horses, boats, etc., humans. All these forms are in this form of heaven of forms. And material things exist by participation in the forms. So that's why you would say something like, the more perfectly just something is, the more it participates in justice itself. That's the kind of language you might hear with regard to Platonic theory of forms. Aside from that, though, there's also Aristotle. His thought was that forms are in the substance instead of being in a heaven of forms. So for Aristotle, you'd have something like, let's move this over a little bit. You'd have a substance equals form and matter. So you would have the matter of a chair, which is like its atomic structure, the wood that makes it up, right? And then you have the form being its chairness. Together, these things are what the chair actually is. Its essence, a chair. Its matter, the atomic structure, and so on. So these two, there's a famous painting where Plato is pointing up to the heavens, and Aristotle is pointing out to the world. And that's kind of what that's referencing, is this difference between them on forms. Because Aristotle learned from Plato. Plato was his teacher. And then Plato learned from Socrates. We don't have writings from Socrates besides what Plato recorded about him in the Socratic dialogues. So it's not exact in terms of like, was this Plato's idea? Was it Socrates' idea? Is this what Plato really believed? There's debate about that and such, uncertainty. But in general, this is kind of how you might sketch out the ideas. It's the heaven of forms, which is usually attributed to Plato. And then forms are more so in the substances themselves. And then there's a third idea. This one came much later. I'm going to put Aquinas' name down here, but it's really more so of a scholastic idea. Aquinas is just probably the most famous person you've read about it, if you have, in the Summa Contra Gentiles. So here Aquinas, and then elsewhere other scholastics throughout Christendom, and I think also Islam and Judaism also had philosophers who wrote about similar things like this. But they wrote about this one, it's a bit different. So for Plato, there's a heaven of many, many forms. And this kind of brings in some questions. So for example, there is the idea of the infinite multitude of forms that can kind of spiral out of control. This is one of the critiques of the heaven of forms. It's something like having something maybe some, I mean, you can think of some kind of very, very specific things like a bowls with, X atoms, bowls with X plus 1 atoms, etc. You might think about these like there's ways to like create an infinite multitude of forms that don't really have significant differences. I don't know if this example fully works, but you can kind of get the idea that there's one of the critiques is how the forms there's just so many, there's infinite number, and many of them don't really seem to significantly differ from each other. And the idea that they each have their own specific form inside this heaven of forms seems kind of odd. It doesn't really sit well with us. So Aristotle's, of course, doesn't have that problem as much. There's not a heaven of forms. But Aquinas's and the scholastic thought is a little bit different than both of theirs. It's kind of almost a union of them, or evolution of them each. Because the idea for them is that there is the form of being itself, or existence itself. And this form encompasses all the others. And this comes into something we call divine simplicity. Because ultimately, this form of being itself is usually identified with God. And that's because, when you see the conclusions he makes in the Summa Contra Gentiles, you'll understand this form of being itself has to be omniscient, because it contains all knowledge and all being in itself. So, of course, it'd be contradictory for there to be something that exists that it doesn't know about, because if it exists, it's part of being itself, and therefore it knows about it. Same with omnipotence. If it's literally existence itself, then obviously it has power over all existence. Then there's omnibenevolence, because Aquinas argues in the Summa Contra Gentiles, the first book, that it has to be goodness itself as well. Because if we understand goodness to be a form of activity, a form of reality, then, it has to be part of being itself as well. And you can kind of see how these are all starting to turn into something very divine sounding. And then it also has a will and an intellect. Because if will and intellect exist, then it has to be part of existence. So, you can kind of see how all this is starting to flow from the idea of, if there is something called being or existence itself, and everything else that exists participates in it, has its being by participation in it, then you can kind of see how it's probably God, or what we would understand God to be, the thing we reference by the word God. And divine simplicity is the idea that the form of being itself, existence itself, all the other the forms aren't separate, like in Plato, where there's all these different forms all out about this heaven of forms. For the scholastics, it's just being itself. And all these other forms, like coarseness, justice, goodness, truth, love, etc., these are all in this form itself, this form being itself. Just we only understand these forms by understanding this form of being through different modes. So it's like considering God with respect to justice or something, or with respect to what is due to one's neighbor. That might be what we consider justice to be. So this kind of view is kind of a synthesis of these two, because the forms do exist, because material things do exist by participation in the forms. But at the same time, there's not an infinite multitude of forms. There's being itself. Just one form, divine simplicity. They all exist by participation therein. And it also draws from Aristotle, because it is a form of participation in one being. It's not an infinite multitude of forms in the heavens. Things can exist in the form of matter. So it's different but similar to both of these other theories. And there's a lot more we can go into here, but I think this is a pretty broad overview of the different understandings of form. So bringing that back to Honkai Star Rail, we have the paths, and you can kind of see how these are related to the forms, right? So propagation in the game is usually referred to something as like, well, something is walking the path of propagation, or walking the path of the hunt, right? And like there's some characters of the hunt who are hunters. Well, then they would say, oh yes, you're doing very well following the path of the hunt. And well, the path of the hunt obviously refers to a form of hunting in the abstract, the idea of hunting in general, which is a form of hunting. But it's not exactly the same, right? Because the context where they're using path and eons is usually referring to certain kinds of movements. So you would have something like, you don't hear about paths that don't have eons. Maybe it's a better way to put it. You don't hear about the path of horses. There's not the path of chairs. So that it's not used exactly the same way. And of course, the authors haven't made an explicit link between these two, so we can't say. They might bring up some more ideas about paths that aren't really exactly related to forms. But in general, you can kind of understand how they're related from a philosophical point of view. What's interesting, though, is that the eons, how the relationship between the eons and the paths and the forms. Because you have something like this example here with Taezyronth and the propagation. Because Taezyronth, first of all, became an eon. And second of all, died. I should say it in time as well. And the swarm disaster. Probably should move this away, but I don't actually know how to do that. But, yes, Taezyronth, the eon of propagation. There was a point where the path of propagation flourished with Taezyronth at its head, and that's what began the swarm disaster. So he actually ascended to eonhood. He was an eon before, and became one, and then he was killed. So, and even then, the path of propagation continued on without him. Obviously, because if it didn't, then there would be no propagation left, and nothing would propagate, which obviously makes no sense. So the form of propagation wasn't affected or changed in any way, but at some point, something caused a path of propagation to be apparent to the universe, to the residents of the universe, and this being called Taezyronth was its eon. So the first question here then is, what exactly is the relationship between an eon, a path, and the thing itself, e.g. the form? The last question isn't really brought up by the game. That's just kind of what I'm throwing in there, as the reader and the player is kind of wondering as well. Because obviously the hunt, annihility, destruction, these are really interesting ideas to contemplate and to understand. And it's obvious as well that the Nook, the destruction, isn't destruction itself, because the Nook is trying to destroy everything. And if he was destruction itself, it would just happen, because he would be the form itself of destruction. And the path itself isn't like an all-consuming power, otherwise everything would have been destroyed already. So there's obviously some kind of difference here in terms of what these things are, and that's the first question we have to ask. And the second question would be, how does an eon ascend? Because it seems as though every single eon we've heard of somehow ascended or became it. We haven't really heard a confirmation. Maybe there are eternal eons that just always existed. We haven't really heard about that. And the only ones we've heard about have been ones that ascended. And third, how does an eon die? And this is interesting because these three questions here that we're talking about were actually the very questions referenced by Kafka in the Xianzhou Laofu when we meet her. Because during this meeting with Kafka, she asks us about, or she comes and talks about why she's there. And what she reveals to us in that conversation. I guess this is spoilers for something like patch 1.2, I think. I think it's 1.2, maybe 1.1. Somewhere around there. Maybe it actually could have been the base game too. I don't remember how far we got in that. But you do meet Kafka. I think it's 1.1, 1.2. But you meet her and she talks about how the goal is to fight and defeat Nanook the Destruction. And to that point, she brings up that there are three ways an eon can die. One is Aeon's path can be consumed by another's. This happened with Enna the Order, I think, was consumed by Shipe the Harmony. The second is that an eon, or two paths, two eons, can be in conflict. Examples might be Land the Hunt versus the Abundance. As well as the Swarm Disaster, where multiple eons conspired to destroy Taziroth. And the third, we don't know because Kafka didn't answer the question, if I recall correctly. So thinking about these three ways, it's kind of interesting because in the first idea, a path being consumed by another's path, order into harmony. Again, the forms themselves couldn't have been affected because order is just order. It exists regardless, right? It still exists. It's just that harmony is a more general or broad idea, perhaps. I wouldn't even argue that. I think harmony and order are used in different ways. But in the game, it's argued, I guess, that the idea of harmony swallowed up the idea of order. And they kind of merged together. And Shipe the Harmony was the result of that. But even then, the path of order, so to speak, maybe it's part of the path of harmony, but the form of order and form of harmony will continue to be separate things and will continue to be what they are. So that's one kind of difference between the three. The two eons can be in conflict. Well, we see that eons being in conflict doesn't even mean anything about their paths, because even after Tezirant died, propagation is still a thing. People still propagate. And propagation itself isn't really in any kind of contradiction with hunting or nihility, right, or destruction. So it's interesting that the kind of core story of Honkai Star Rail very much revolves around the eons. In the Storm Disaster 2, there are moments when you encounter the eons, and that's kind of one idea behind the eons and the paths that might be interesting, is the idea of encounter, as well as the idea of human hearts, or I guess maybe you should say the movement of hearts with respect to forms. What I mean by this is that the eons seem to be a way to encounter the form in some way. When you have a meeting with Ix the Nihility, for example, inside the Storm Disaster, there's this description of how you become very numb, very tired, how you're falling asleep, how things are kind of becoming monochrome, a feeling of death. And there's an urgency of Herta trying to pull you out of that. And that's because the encounter with Ix feels like an encounter with these concepts in the Nihility, right? So Nihility is like, I don't know what that is. Oops. The encounter with the Nihility is like death and numbness, depression, emptiness, meaninglessness, things like that. So the encounter with Ix is like almost like an encounter with these ideas, with the forms themselves. And so the encounters with the eons are always treated as very awe-inspiring, right? Because you're not just encountering a person, but you're kind of experiencing the forms in a more direct and real way. Remember, the forms are the more general or higher truths about things. So if you found an eon of justice, for example, you feel like you'd be meeting justice itself. And that actually be a very inspiring thing. And that's why when I think about paths, I'm thinking kind of almost like because they talk about paths as in terms of movement, right? There's like a movement, a path that you can walk on. And I'm wondering if maybe the paths are related to human hearts in a way, in terms of how we encounter and experience the forms. And that maybe that's how eons ascend. Because we know from Nanook's story, the little bits we've heard of, is that he came from a world that was very, very tragic. It suffered many, many wars. It was part of the Swarm Disaster and experienced all kinds of devastation. And there's a kind of pertinent note about in the description about what kind of person could have been born from such a world. And since that person became Nanook the Destruction, you can kind of see, well, okay, there probably was a very tragic story there that had many, many movements of hearts towards a kind of destructive of everything feeling, right? A kind of ultimate despair. So it might be that the paths are something like movement or energy, because they talk a lot about things like imaginary energy in the game, or imaginary, referring to things like maybe more like metaphysical kind of superconscious things. It's not super clear, but it might be that the idea they're going for with the paths and eons being formed of the paths is that if there's something that moves many, many hearts and feelings and emotions and lives and things in a certain way, certain pattern, that might form a path along a certain kind of form. And then the head of that would be the Aeon, whoever is, I guess, leading the charge on that, so to speak. So that's just there's obviously no confirmation of this. This is more theory crafting at this point, or lore crafting, if you want to call it that. But in general, I think this idea of the forms in Greek philosophy tying into these makes a lot of sense. They're obviously different, but there's a commonality here that makes this discussion very interesting to look into. I think as we can progress in the story of Honkai Star Rail, we'll find that more and more these three questions become very pertinent to the story and how it unfolds. That's all I have this time. Hopefully y'all enjoyed this and learned a bit about Greek philosophy and the forms and metaphysics. And maybe it gives you some food for thought about these higher things in life. It's interesting because when we talk about the higher truths of things, Aquinas says that wisdom is knowing the highest truths about things. And philosophy comes from the words philo and sophia. Philo meaning love of a certain kind, and sophia, wisdom. So philosophy, you might even say, is a love of understanding the highest truths about things. So you might even say that this is kind of the heart of philosophy we're talking about here. In Honkai Star Rail, of all places. Anyway, I hope that was interesting to everyone. I will probably continue this series next with a discussion about existentialism. Because when it comes to nihility, for example, there's a lot of references in the English translation. I don't know if it's present in the other translations of the game. But there's a lot of references to existential authors when it comes to themes of Ix the nihility. And I want to dive into that next, I think. So, look forward to another video. In the meantime, hope this is useful. Of course, you can always look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you want to learn more about these things, which I heavily encourage. Alright, have a good day.